So I wanted to talk today about guilt and the problem with guilt, because it's something I've had a lot of conversations about recently. And it's something that I think we all grapple with, particularly as we get older, we take on more responsibilities, and whether that is guilt in terms of our work and how much we should or shouldn't be doing, how much time we should be devoting to it, whether it is in terms of our family, and being present and available, being around, being a good parent, being a good son or daughter, being a good husband or wife, being a good partner. All of those things I think are connected. And I thought I've had, like, as I said, I've had quite a few conversations with guilt, and I've wrestled with my own guilt constantly over the years. But it's something that came up for me, particularly when I was when I was signing up to go and do the snowboarding workshop that I did back in March. And I I sort of got in contact to sign up back in January, and then for the next 2 months, it was something going round in my head and stopped me sleeping at times. So I thought it was something that's worth exploring, and just to help you out, because I think, as with many things and with many concepts, there can be some unhelpful sort of common misconceptions around guilt, and I think there can be some shoulds around guilt, ironically, and what we should and shouldn't be doing. And most commonly, like this idea that don't feel guilty, you should be taking your time for yourself. I mean, the command of don't and the should word creeping back in there, give you a sense of actually how ridiculous that is. That actually, when we do have responsibilities, then actually it's very hard not to feel guilty. So there can even be guilt in terms of talking about guilt. It's almost like something that we need to push down or not admit to, or admit to and then feel guilty about feeling guilty. Honestly, it becomes such a cycle. So what I wanted to start with is just thinking about what guilt actually is. And I thought that might be helpful. Take a bit of a psychologist and psychological perspective to what guilt is, what it is, what it isn't, where it's helpful, where it's not helpful, and therefore actually what we can do about it if it is less helpful and is preventing us from doing things that either we want or we really need to do for ourselves. So just to sort of think about, well, what guilt is. I mean, the reality is guilt is an emotion. Yeah, it's something that we experience, and it's a reaction. So it's a reaction to events that happen or don't happen. They can be, we can feel guilty for imaginary events. We can feel guilty for dreams that we've had. So it can be either something concrete or it can be something that doesn't exist. And it can serve a really important function. So it's it's thinking about it that, you know, I was just been reading a really interesting article by Dr. Lawrence Howells, which he wrote in the Psychologist magazine. And he talks about guilt being the result of two related processes. So it's the standards that we hold for ourselves, and it's then the interpretation of our behavior against those standards. So what are our values? What are our standards that we may not even think about very often, or we might not be able to articulate in terms of what they are? Because how often do we sit down and go, these are my values, these are my standards. They are what we live by, but they're not necessarily always explicit or present in our mind. And then what we do is we have these standards, and then we interpret our own behavior or our own thoughts in relation to whether or not we've met those standards. And those standards and values can come from all different places in our lives. So they can be predominantly about our experiences and our childhood experiences and how we've grown up, what we have been brought up to believe is important and is good for us, and matters. They are also our experiences as we are out in the world, in the environment. They are societal expectations and they are cultural expectations. And so all of this, these different sort of threats and these different aspects of our lives go in to form the standards and the values that we live by. So these tend to be quite permanent, particularly if we don't think about them very much. They tend to be embedded from an early age. Again, depending on the environment that we're operating in, those can reinforce or they can go against those. And it may be if we're brought up in a particularly unconventional way, then that may be challenged by the societies or the norms that are standards or norms that a society would hold up. But those standards are there, those values that our personal values are there, and we may not necessarily really think about them. Where the guilt tends to come in is when we feel that our behavior hasn't met those standards that we have set for ourselves. So it may be that we don't feel we were as kind to somebody as we believe is important to be. Or we may feel that, if we've snapped at our child several times a day, in my case, because they've not because they've triggered us in some way, or because we've become frustrated and we've set high standards in terms of actually, I believe it's important to show up with patience and in control with my child, we can feel guilty for the way in which we've reacted. Equally, it can drive our own behavior towards if we feel other people aren't necessarily meeting those standards as well. So it's really important that we think about actually what are the standards that I've set myself? Where has this guilt come from? So to use my example of the snowboarding workshop, that for me, I was not feeling so guilty about the idea of taking time for myself. I know that's important. I believe that's important. And it's something that my own parents set as a model for me. It is a value that's been instilled in me, and I also fundamentally know it's really important for my own mental health and well-being that I do activities and that I do things that light me up too. And I know that it helps me to be more patient and to cope better sometimes with the other strains that come with family life or working, whatever. The guilt for me was twofold. I had a guilt around money. Should I be spending the money that this cost on me when there are so many other needs, and in terms of the family, and in terms of it came at a time of year where unfortunately I just lost a contract with a client because they'd moved on, and that was completely fine, but it just happened to coincide with that particular point. So I was thinking, okay, so I had this money which I'd put aside, but suddenly the pressure on that money, is it okay for me to use that for myself? Actually, that could go towards a family holiday, or it could go towards, all sorts of other things that my family need. And I really wrestled with that. And the second aspect of guilt was around my safety, because I was going off and I was doing a snowboarding workshop that I knew involved, it was a backcountry workshop. I knew it involved, spending most of the time off piste and doing the type of snowboarding that's really challenging for me. I was less worried at that point about my ability to do it, but about me not being in control of the conditions, the snow conditions. What if something happened to me? I have a responsibility to be there for my children. And that to me is a really strong value that I hold, that, it is important that I'm present in their lives, that I'm there for them. Should I be putting them first or me first? Is this selfish? Is this truly selfish to put myself in a potentially dangerous situation? And so those were the thoughts, that was the guilt that kept me up at night. And so that's just to give you an illustration of how, my own personal standards in terms of, whether it was being a present and available parent, of putting, my children's needs first, whether it was this idea of of money and whose money is it and how we operate that as a family. Those were things that, and I was questioning whether my behavior in terms of signing up for this workshop and going along and committing to it was in line with those other standards that I held dear. And there was also a clash, a conflict in terms of I also believe that's important to do things that I love and spend time for myself. This guilt can come across in all aspects of work. If we're somebody who's particularly conscientious and feels it's important to show up for other people, be a good team player, a good colleague, it can lead us to working much longer hours potentially, or taking on projects or saying yes to projects that push us into a place of burnout. Because we feel guilty that we are not as committed as we should be. Again, that lovely word should. Guilt can come through in all forms, and it can hold us to account. So it can be a really useful way of helping us to stay in line or to contribute usefully to society, to show up in a committed and important way for our colleagues and our families and our friends. But it can also go into overdrive, and it can lead us to make decisions based on what we feel we should be doing versus the reality. And I guess that's really what this exploration is about. What is real? What is truly, what are the things that maybe we should be feeling guilty for, if that's a thing? What are realistic standards to set for ourselves? And maybe what are less realistic? When do those standards become too high? When are we aspiring to reach something that actually we can never reach, or it's become a stick with which to beat ourselves? And one way of doing this is to think about, are we responding to those standards and values is our interpretation of and how we responded to them, is that fair? Is it fair to expect ourselves to react in a certain way? And an example might be, and a way of thinking about this is to take these expectations to the extreme. So for example, my values are to be, present and available for my children when they need me. To the extreme, that would be, I must always be there 100% when my children are around and when they're back from school. I should not leave the house. I should drop everything, no matter what else is going on, the minute they call for me, because I need to be present and available. And when we start to think about it, we might go, actually, and a way of thinking about it is if a friend was saying this to you, would you go, well, is that fair? Is that reasonable to expect that of yourself, that you would have nothing else going on in that time? And you'll probably go, well, no, it's probably not necessarily fair. There are other aspects of our lives, there are other responsibilities we need to take on. And also, it's not necessarily healthy for our children just to have us at their beck and call, and drop everything the minute they need something, because they need to be able to do something for ourselves. So we might go, actually, that's not reasonable. So what does being present and available actually mean? Does it mean physically present? Does it mean that actually, if I am feeling filled up, if I am feeling energized, then I have better relationships with my family, with my partner, with my children, and therefore actually it's important for me to spend time doing things that I enjoy too. It might be in terms of looking at a work scenario, I should always be, I should always follow through on my word. When I say I'm going to do something for my colleagues, I should always do it. And I need to be available to support them, or to do the work. I should always get my work done. And then that can lead us. So what's the extreme? That I'm available 24 hours, no matter what somebody else needs, in order to deliver that piece of work. Or I should take on other people's work or responsibilities if they're finding it too much, in order to make sure that the team stays strong. We take them to those extremes. You go, actually, it's probably not reasonable that I'm available 24/7. It's because I need to sleep and I need to do other things. So what is a reasonable response? What allows me to protect the work that I need to do to show up well for my colleagues, but also to protect my own mental health and well-being too? And the thing with guilt is that we rarely, because it's an emotion, because it's a feeling, and it's a deeply uncomfortable feeling, it's not as intense as other emotions. It's not like anger where we might get a flash of it. It comes on as this deeply uncomfortable niggle that we can't get rid of. And that we start to ruminate on, and that we wake up in the middle of the night and we're going through it and we're feeling terrible about something we should or shouldn't have done. I should have called this friend. I should have followed up on that piece of work. Whatever it is, it's pervasive and it can take over our lives. And because it's a feeling, we will often, one of my favorite sort of saying from a psychology point of view is that just because we feel something, just because we think something, it doesn't make it real. And the first point I think we have to navigate when we're thinking about guilt and how we respond is that, is it reasonable that I feel guilty about this? Have I actually done something that deserves this level of rumination, this level of discomfort, or that drives my actions to do something, to apologize, to change my course, to take on additional responsibilities or work, to not do the thing that I want to do? Is that reasonable? And But we need to be able, the first step really is to be conscious and aware that that is an option to us. So just because we feel guilty, it doesn't mean that what we are doing is wrong. Guilt is a response. And as I said, it is grounded in our background and our experience and, childhood, sort of memories and all of these things that we're not conscious of that go into forming who we are. But unless we pause and explore, actually, what is this guilt about? What is it trying to tell me? Because also we can feel guilty when we are tired and overwhelmed, and those feelings become more pervasive when we are exhausted. What is this trying to tell me? What is going on in my life? What is this feeling? What is in conflict here? And is this guilt about anger as well? Because emotions can disguise themselves as other emotions. Once we understand what that guilt is about, then we can start to think about whether it is reasonable or unreasonable. In the case of my workshop, I went, it's reasonable to feel worried and anxious about, being able to show up for my family and not getting injured. At the same time, I am therefore have chosen, I'm not going off on my own into, the great unknown all by myself. I am going with highly experienced instructors and guides who I know, who I trust, people who know the area really well. And I have to trust that they want to stay safe too. And so therefore, it feels that this is as safe as I can make it. And I also, for me, will caveat it with, how much are we in control of our daily lives and keeping ourselves at any one point anyway? So therefore, I need to balance that out. If I've done a risk assessment, if I feel that there is more in terms of, other people have been thinking about the safety aspects of this too, I need to some level trust that they are looking at this and they have far more knowledge and experience about this than I do. In terms of the money, and that did make me feel guilty, I also went, do you know what? I worked really hard towards the end of last year. I had, lots of, I had some really great clients. I'd put a huge amount of work into building to a place in the business where I was able to finance this. I didn't go last year because we had other stuff going on. And yes, it's a risk that I'm taking right now in terms of that money could go towards something else. But actually, I'm choosing right now to prioritize my needs here, my need for headspace. I know that when I do this, I do show up better. I do feel fulfilled and centered and more like me, and that is really important. So I'm going to make this commitment, and I'm going to sit alongside the discomfort of this. And that is says a lot about how we navigate guilt is that we have to be able to sit alongside that discomfort. And sometimes, in order to explore it in the first place, and sometimes we go with a decision that fundamentally we believe is the right decision for us, even if those feelings of guilt continue to exist. And we act with them alongside with them. We don't try and get rid of them. We don't try and remove them. We sit alongside them, having made those assessments and judgments for ourselves. So if you want 3 points just to take away, to think about in terms of guilt and whether it's signing up, whether it's getting up on a Saturday morning, going out for 20 minutes for a run, whether it is, finishing work at a reasonable time on a Friday, whether it is doing something for you versus doing something for somebody else or for the family. I would say these are 3 steps really to think about. Is 1, accept that just because you feel something, just because it feels so present and alive for you, it doesn't make it real. It doesn't mean that actually what you are doing is wrong. What it's saying is maybe you need to just explore and think about this. Maybe this feels uncomfortable. And because particularly if we're not practiced in taking time for ourselves or making decisions that put us first, that can feel deeply uncomfortable too. So is this guilt discomfort, but it's still something that I feel is important to do? Or is this guilt trying to tell me something? So recognize the emotion and take a step back from it. Then the second thing is to think about, are the standards that I'm setting for myself reasonable? And are the behaviors that I'm expecting of myself to act in accordance with those standards, are those reasonable? Are those fair? Now, if you need to check this out with somebody else, please do. If it helps to put yourself in the position of what advice would I give to a friend, that can be a really useful tool to use. But think about, is what I'm asking of myself reasonable here? And then the third point is really, sometimes, even though we may not get rid of that guilt, we may not be able to totally assuage it, but maybe once we've done that balance and that assessment, and is this something that actually does matter for me, we need to find a way to sit alongside that discomfort. As Elizabeth Gilbert talks about, we need to get it in the back seat, and not allow it to drive our decisions. So, okay, I'm probably going to, and I did when I went to that workshop, I carried on feeling guilty for quite a bit of it. But I'd chosen, I accepted it. That's going to be there. That's fine. That's part of this. That's part of parenting. It just comes with the territory. But do you know what? I'm going to just have that voice quieten down a bit, enough so that I can still get the most, I can enjoy this experience, I can embrace this experience. And that took some work. And it wasn't always like I just kept in the back seat and going. There were times when even when I was on that workshop and it would take over, and actually it impacted on my snowboarding one day, because it got into my head. But I think keeping on working on it, keeping on accepting that it's going to be there and finding tools to navigate it is hugely important. So you won't always get rid of guilt, but can you find the tools to help you to manage it to a reasonable level? So I hope that's been helpful for you. As always, please do reach out if you've got any questions or any thoughts about this. I'd love to know your thoughts. This is going to be turned into an article and blog on Substack as well. It'll also be on my website. So I'd love you to read and contribute and get back to me on your thoughts around guilt, whether it's guilt around adventure, whether it's guilt about your other aspects of your life, and what tools you find to manage it too. So as always, take care. You can find me on Instagram, Resilience at Work, or Everyday Adventure Pod. You can find me on Substack, Everyday Adventure Podcast. You can find me via my website, resiliencework.co.uk, or LinkedIn, Nikki Bass. Please do reach out and get in touch. Take care. Speak to you soon. Bye.